in 1984 and 1985. Attended but was not invited to speak, and was clearly miffed. Ronald Perelman, now chairman of Revlon, opened the conference, and Dr. Armand Hammer, chairman of Occidental, closed it. There were also presentations by Beatrice, Gulf Plus Western, Burroughs, Warner Communications and Lear Siegler. As one of the conference organizers exclaimed excitedly, "It's the Academy Awards of business." The old ethos was still there, though not as strident and all-encompassing as in years past. In one of the videos that are produced each year at Milken's direction, Dallas Jr. Ewing, Larry Hagman, appeared, flashing a Drexel Express titanium card, which, he declared, had a $10 billion line of credit. Jr. urged, "Don't go hunting without it." But the best line of the conference, most participants agreed, was delivered by Nelson Peltz, who was asked to give a presentation for the Phi RST Time. A year earlier, Peltz had been a nervous hopeful, with nothing to his name but a controlling interest in a meager wire and cable company. Now he was magically transformed into one of the nation's industrialists, with a controlling interest in a $4 billion empire. In a play on Winston Churchill's famous declaration, Peltz gazed out at the crowd, many of them holders of his bonds, and declared, "Never have so few owed so much to so many." Martin Siegel played a prominent role, appearing on a panel and at one point, in reference to his move from the Bluenose Kidder to the Dread Drexel, donned Phi RST a white cowboy hat and then a black. His old Kidder clients, among them the chairman of Lear Siegler and Pan American, seemed rather dazzled by it all. One guest wondered, "Wow, Marty, does Kidder throw these kinds of things?" But probably no one was more dazzled than Siegel himself. The personal wealth there, he calculated, was 3 times the GNP. And it was not only the sheer dollars but the power and influence that he found so awe-inspiring. One manifestation of that growing power and influence was a political presence far larger than at any previous conference. Senators Bill Bradley and Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio and Alan Cranston of California all spoke at the conference. Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole was supposed to appear as a surprise speaker at a corporate finance breakfast, but he canceled at the last moment. Representative Timothy Worth of Colorado and Massachusetts Senator Edward M. Kennedy came, but they were not speakers. Kennedy told me, recalled Tubby Burnham, "I'm here to listen and to learn." Drexel had spared no effort, and no expense, in educating Congress over the past year and a half. Representative Worth was one of the early recipients of Drexel's lavish attentions, not surprisingly, since he chaired the hearings of the House Subcommittee on Telecommunications, Consumer Protection and Finance on Takeovers, in 1984 and again in the Phi RST half of 1985. At Phi RST, Worth spearheaded the congressional assault, but by April 1985, when he attended the Predators Ball, he was straddling the fence, and by the end of that year he had become a staunch supporter of Drexel and its junk bonds. In fact, one of his top aides, David Aylward, left his job with Worth to help organize Alliance for Capital Access, a lobby formed to oppose federal limits on junk bond financings, formed by Drexel clients at Drexel's prompting. The leader of Alliance was Larry Meisel of MDC Holdings, a longtime issuer of junk bonds and also a major subscriber to the bonds in the takeover deals. Under the Federal Election Campaign Act, the limits on contributions to candidates per election are $1,000 for a contribution by an individual and $5,000 by a multi-candidate committee, the category in which Drexel's Political Action Committee falls. In 1985, Drexel's PAC donated $2,000 to Worth, falling short of its limit by $3,000. But contributions by individuals at the Phi including $1,000 from both Michael and Lowell Milken, and $1,000 from Gary Winnick, who left the firm in the fall of '85, totaled about $17,000. Roughly $9,000 of this was comprised of donations of $250 from members of the Milken Group. There were also some contributions from Milken's extended family. Donations from Tom Spiegel, Abraham Spiegel, Helena Spiegel, Adita Spiegel, Lee Eckel, a Columbia Savings Director, and a Columbia PAC totaled $7,150. While Drexel executives knew that Worth was their supporter by the latter half of 1985, Wachtell, Lipton, with Martin Lipton spearheading the anti-junk crusade, apparently did not. In late 1985, 20 members of the Wachtell firm each donated $500 to Worth, for a total of $10,000. By mid-1985, the center of activity for anti-takeover legislation had shifted from the House to the Senate, and Senator Alphonse M. D'Amato of New York, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee's Subcommittee on Securities, had primacy. Drexel was by far the biggest donor among financial RMS to D'Amato from 1981 to 1986. Its contributions totaled $70,750. The next highest D'Amato contribution from an investment banking firm was Morgan Stanley's at $40,600. As reported by Bruce Ingersoll and Brooks Jackson in the Wall Street Journal, Drexel's courting of D'Amato moved into high gear at the end of May 1985, when D'Amato was preparing to hold hearings on proposed legislation. One bill would have curbed the use of junk bonds in takeovers and buyouts, and another would have limited junk bond purchases by thrifts. Harry Horowitz, Milken's boyhood chum who joined Milken's group in 1979 to perform administrative functions and by the mid-80s was his Washington lobbyist and Predators ball organizer, set up a fundraising dinner for D'Amato at Chasen's in Beverly Hills. The guest list at that dinner included 23 executives from Drexel and a half dozen from Columbia Savings and Loan, including Thomas Spiegel. D'Amato's take from this dinner was more than $33,000. During the late spring of 1985, the wave of anti-takeover sentiment in Congress was cresting, and many legislators were eager to take some action. According to the Journal account, D'Amato assured his fellow senators that he would have legislation ready to be considered before the summer recess. That, however, did not happen. It was December 1985 when D'Amato finally had his draft bill readied, and by that time the issue had lost its heat. In any event, D'Amato's proposed legislation carried no provisions onerous to Drexel. On the subject of junk bonds, he suggested a federal study. 5 days after D'Amato introduced his innocuous bill, Fred Joseph and 35 other Drexel executives each donated $500 to the senator's campaign. In the end, of the 30 bills that dealt with regulating takeovers in 1984 and 1985, not one passed. While Drexel's, and other investment banking firms too, lobbying efforts were Herculean, at least as much credit for their non-passage must go to the Reagan administration, which had said that it would veto any such legislation. And the SEC, which was of course the agency most involved, did not support any of the proposed bills. This was hardly surprising, considering that it was the pro-takeover attitude of the SEC and the Justice Department, in its antitrust policies, under Reagan that had fueled the M&A activity of the early '80s. The SEC did do a study of junk bonds in takeover financing, which reached the predictable conclusion. Released in June 1986, it stated that there was no justification for new regulatory initiatives aimed at curbing the use of this kind of debt issuance in takeover bids or indeed as it relates to any other aspects of corporate financing activity. In their 1985 annual report, the President's Council of Economic Advisers had weighed in with its conclusions, surprising only in their ambitiousness. They purported to settle once and for all the decades-long debate over whether takeovers are beneficial or harmful. This August council concluded that mergers and acquisitions improve efficiency, transfer scarce resources to higher-valued uses, and stimulate effective corporate management. The conclusion was remarkably definitive but, apparently, more polemical than proven. In some of the more interesting testimony that emerged from the congressional hearings on takeovers, F.M. Shearer, a Swarthmore College economics professor, had rebutted the council's findings. In his testimony in March 1985, he pointed out that the report's conclusion that takeovers improve efficiency relied on stock market event studies, which are short-run in orientation, examining stock prices during periods 10 to 30 days before and after the announcement or consummation of the merger. If one looks at a period of 10 years or so, Professor Shearer testified, the results are very different. Shearer has developed the premier database in this country for looking at the financial consequences of merger. This database draws upon 27 years of merger history and 7 years of sell-off history for nearly 4,000 individual businesses. These are some of Shearer's findings, from his case studies and statistical research. Contrary to the council's view that merger makers sought companies where management had failed, most in fact targeted well-managed entities, such as National Can. What they were generally attracted by was not sick companies or slipshod management but undervalued assets. Takeovers by firms with no managerial expertise in the acquired company's line of business tended to impair, not improve, efficiency. Takeovers frequently led to short-run Professor IT maximizing strategies, such as the cash cow strategy under which a business is starved of R&D, equipment modernization, and advertising funds, and/or prices are set at high levels inviting competitor inroads, leaving in the end a depleted, non-competitive shell. On average, acquisitions were less professor-able for the acquiring firms than the maintenance of existing businesses and the internal development of new business lines. Many takeovers led to sell-offs, which did improve the efficiency of the simpler, self-standing entity. While Shearer had relatively few hostile takeovers in his sampling, in those he did study he found that the takeover aggravated performance deficiencies that existed earlier. In response to questions from panel members, Shearer also made an interesting point about the high leverage, or debt-intensive, capital structures of many U.S. companies, which are coming to resemble Japanese companies' financial structures. Indeed, in the Gospel according to Milken, which is spread by so many of his acolytes, it is often noted that Japanese companies have for years carried much higher debt-to-equity ratios than American companies. True enough, Shearer commented, but the Japanese are able to carry such high levels of debt because when they get into financial difficulties the government bails them out. Shearer's testimony was followed by that of Warren Law, a professor at Harvard Business School. Law too had come to rebut the glittering generalities of the council's report. The council's reliance upon short-run stock market behavior as evidence that takeovers are beneficial, he said, could be accepted only if the stock market were a good judge of intrinsic values. As Milken and his entire coterie of raiders, who had made billions by identifying assets undervalued by the market, could have told this group, it is not. Law added that he did not believe that it could be strictly proven that takeovers deter or promote growth and productivity. Inasmuch as we cannot run history twice with and without them, we can only speculate. With this caveat, however, his speculation is that takeovers decrease productivity. He bases this view on a number of factors. Through takeovers, bigger firms are created, and he believes that large FI-RMS make fewer but bigger errors, tend to continue wrong policies too long, and have the resources to delay until crisis is unmistakable. Furthermore, he pointed out that in the late 1970s approximately half of all corporate acquisitions were also corporate divestitures, many of them businesses which were acquired during the last merger heyday of the 1960s. That wave, he said, was accompanied by an increasing tendency of executive suites to be dominated by people with financial and legal skills. Executives who believed a manager with no special expertise in any particular industry could nevertheless step into an unfamiliar company and run it successfully through strict application of financial controls. The present dismantling of many conglomerates is the result of this folly. There is no reason to believe the result will differ this time. The takeover debate would be laid to rest neither by the 1985 annual report of the President's Council of Economic Advisers nor by Professor Shearer's research. While Shearer's conclusions appeared to be much more soundly based, one reason the debate has been so long-lived is that there is some truth on both sides. Some takeovers do result in more efficient and professor-I-table companies, even when the new manager-owner has no expertise in the industry and has been, as Frank Considine put it, a financial operator, but not an operator, as in the case, thus far, of Carl Icahn and TWA. Some, on the other hand, do result in companies so debt-laden that their R&D budgets are starved and they become non-competitive, as could conceivably become the case with Uniroyal Chemical, which was the Professor-I-table, healthy core of the old Uniroyal and in its brief tenure under Nelson Peltz's aegis earned barely enough to cover the interest charges on its mountain of $1.06 billion debt. The questions that remain, of course, which of these scenarios occurs more often, and whether there is indeed a preponderance sufficiently quantifiable and large that one can conclude that most takeovers are beneficial or harmful, will not be able to be meaningfully addressed for the most recent wave of buyouts and takeovers for years. Despite the reservations that both Shearer and Law voiced about takeovers during their testimony before Congress, neither professor was wholeheartedly endorsing anti-takeover legislation, since both were wary of efforts of the federal government to tinker with the tender offer process. Law, however, did favor legislation to abolish greenmail, and Shearer was in favor of changing the tax law that favors the issuing of debt over equity by making interest payments, on debt, deductible but dividends, on stock, not. No law to abolish greenmail was passed. While sweeping changes were made in the Tax Reform Act of 1986, that debt-favoring provision was not one of them. And the only regulatory measure affecting takeovers that was put into effect gave credence to the view that the government might as well stay out of the takeover arena, since its rules are no sooner passed than they become obsolete. In December 1985, the Federal Reserve Board had proposed a measure that would apply its margin regulations to junk bonds issued by shell companies to finance acquisitions. Margin rules restrict the use of borrowed money in buying stock, generally allowing no more than 50% to be borrowed. As the Fed's proposal was interpreted at the time, this would mean that buyers intent on financing a takeover would be allowed to borrow only 50% of the purchase price against stockholder equity of the target, rather than what had become the vogue in 1985 to 80% or more. In other words, they could no longer buy a company by using the company's own equity as collateral for loans. It was just such an enforcement of the margin rules which FI-RST Unocal, in its petition to the Fed, and later Revlon, in court, had argued for when they were under attack. The Fed's proposed ruling elicited an extraordinarily vehement response from the Reagan administration. The Justice Department was joined in its opposition by the Treasury Department, the Office of Management and Budget and others. Even within the Fed there was dissension. Chairman Paul Volcker, who had been an outspoken critic of high leverage and debt-financed acquisitions, was the measure's driving force, but the two Reagan appointees to the Fed's Board of Governors, Vice Chairman Preston Martin and Martha Seeger, both dissented from the board's recommendation. Wall Street was divided on the measure. Salomon Brothers, for example, was in favor of it, while Drexel of course mounted a blitzkrieg of lobbying against it. Even Milken, who typically did not make the politicking treks to Washington that Fred Joseph, Chris Anderson and others in the firm did, tried to lend a hand. Milken wanted to come and see the chairman and talk about capital markets, recalled Michael Brad Ield, the Fed's general counsel. We wouldn't let him come. Everybody considered that bad form, trying to initiate ex parte contact, trying to get in the back door. It was supposed to be all public comment, Brad Ield continued. In February, after the proposal had been approved, Joseph paid a visit to Volcker. The rule was finally adopted, but considerably watered down. The original proposal might have let the government review proposed takeovers based on the respective sizes of the acquirer and the target. But the rule as passed applied only to hostile takeovers by shell companies, and shell companies narrowly defined as having no assets or operations. After all the furor, the rule was irrelevant. One way to get around it was to use as acquiring vehicle a company that had some business, however slight. Another way was to use preferred stock instead of bonds. Preferred stock generally acts like debt. It pays an interest like dividend, and it gives the holder certain rights a common equity holder does not have, but it counts as equity. In the Drexel-financed $487 million takeover of Warnaco in late April 1986 by a group that included Andrew Gallup, the chairman of 4 small, diverse companies, and Linda Wagner, a former president of Max Factor & Company, Drexel almost seemed to be thumbing its nose at the regulators. W Acquisition Corporation, WAC, represented the ultimate in the shell acquirer. Not only was WAC a shell corporation with no publicly available financial statements, but the individual bidders, who were providing only slightly more than 1% of the needed financing, were disclosing no financial statements with respect to anybody on the bidder's side. Indeed, it was not clear who would be in control of Warnaco, should the WAC tender offer succeed. All that was really known was that Drexel was expected to raise the financing. At least Icahn and Perelman and Peltz had been identified bidders, with some investment in the offer through their respective vehicles. It was clear they would control, if their tenders succeeded, and they each had to disclose their business histories. But by the early spring of 1986, Drexel was telling the world, including its lawmakers and regulators, all abject, that it had ceased to matter who the bidders were. It was a tender offer and it was money good, because Drexel was behind it, and that was all that mattered. Drexel got around the Fed rule by raising half the financing as common and preferred stock and the other half as debt. Following the announcement of the merger agreement, most of the equity financing was converted into debt. So much for the Fed. 11. Proven profit, so far. It was no wonder that by the fall of 1986 the Drexel juggernaut seemed unstoppable. Congress had been quieted. The takeover debate would continue, but in academia, not in the halls of Congress. And the Fed's action had been rendered impotent. The force in this country buying high-yield securities has overpowered all regulation, Milken had announced to a group of pension fund managers and others in April 1986, as reported in The Washington Post. The investors have recognized increased value, and those financial institutions who dare to move into this area have been well rewarded. Indeed, free of any constraints, Milken's machine was working like a dream. And his critics, many of whom had been prophesying a debt-triggered doomsday for the last 2 years or so, were twisting in the wind. One of the most thoughtful was James Grant, editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, who had carved out his anti-junk position back in September 1984. Grant explained that he had reached this point of view, FI-RST, because the world even at that time was long on debt and short on equity, and he followed the old investment adage that one should own the thing in short supply and shun the thing in surplus. What an illiquid world needs is cash, he reasoned, and so the debt security to own, if one chooses to own debt at all, is the one with the highest ratio of cash FL to interest expense, not, in other words, the junk securities of companies which typically have little financial leeway. Second, Grant reasoned that the holdings of junk bonds were so concentrated in a handful of institutions, Milken's inner circle, which issued bonds and bought each other's paper, as to invalidate the argument of safety through diversify cation in one's portfolio. And, third, he declared that the junk idea had been carried too far, and that a faddishness had grown around its progenitor and proselytizer, Milken. Thus, Grant declared in September 1984, "Our hunch is that, in some basic way, junk has had its day." 2 months later, in November 1984, when Drexel refinanced John Kluge's leveraged buyout of the Metromedia Broadcasting Corporation and issued $1.30 billion of junk bonds, then the largest junk issue ever, Grant had sounded the alarms. He quoted extensively from the prospectus, which said, in the plain, daunting language that would thenceforth become junk boilerplate, that the company might not be able to pay its investors their interest or, for that matter, their principal. Grant's concern, however, was apparently not shared by the buyers, who grabbed up the Metromedia bonds, some of which promised, if all went well, interest of 155/8%. 6 months later, Grant was eating crow. In May 1985, Rupert Murdoch, the publishing magnate, bid $2 billion for the Metromedia television stations, not the radio stations. And he agreed to assume the whole Kluge debt, and pay some $650 million besides, for the television assets. In a mere 6 months, the value of the stations had appreciated by $650 million. This, Grant noted rightly, had added vitality to the already prevalent investment outlook that assumed not a recession but prosperity, that counted on something good just around the corner to make the balance sheet balance. Hot on the heels of Murdoch Metromedia came Storer Communications, at $1.93 billion, further testament to this kind of investment faith. Like Metromedia, Storer did not have enough money to meet its FI-XED charges out of cash FLO, and like Metromedia it contained a healthy quantity of zero-coupon bonds, 1/3 of the total, in its mix of securities. The zero-coupon bond was vital to these deals. Sold at a discount from its face value, it requires no interest payments, hence, zero coupon, until maturity, when the annual accrued interest and the principal are paid out. Drexel had pioneered the heavy use of zero-coupon bonds in junk deals, especially in the communications industry, where the company in the foreseeable future could not make its interest payments. The day of reckoning for many of these deals, with securities issued in 1985 and 1986, would be years away. Now, in early fall 1986, Grant was still in print, and unswerving. He articulated a theory of a credit cycle in debt expansions, in which a gradual shift from vigilance to recklessness in lending and borrowing takes place, and he postulated that the current cycle had reached the reckless, or manic, phase. In this phase, the public competes frenziedly for securities of higher and higher yield, and poorer quality. Using the junk mutual funds as a benchmark, Grant pointed out that as recently as 1982, only 45% of the fund's holdings had comprised bonds rated single B or lower, or not rated at all, and as of mid-1986 such securities made up 68% of those funds' portfolios. Edward Altman, a finance professor at New York University who wrote a book entitled Investing in Junk Bonds, also asserts that credit quality of new issues, after improving over the 1978 to 1984 period, began to deteriorate in 1985. And Gail Hessel of Standard & Poor's asserted in Businessweek in November 1986 that within the junk universe the new issues were at the lower end of credit quality. It was noteworthy that at the same time that junk was becoming junkier, it had been comprising a growing percentage of the entire corporate debt market. A total of $50 billion of junk was issued in 1985–86. Junk rose from 11% of the total corporate debt issued in 1982 to 24% in 1985. This does not include all the debt that was downgraded into the junk nether regions, $20 billion over the 1985–86 period, much of it as a result of takeovers and buyouts. By year-end 1986, the junk market had grown from $15 billion a decade earlier to about $125 billion. If the quality of junk was deteriorating, one would expect there to be an increasing number of defaults, although the junkiest of issues, being the most recent, would not yet have had time to go into the can. For the period 1978 to 1985, the average default rate as a percentage of the junk debt outstanding was 1.222%. The year with the highest default rate was 1982, with 3.12%. 1980 by comparison, had only 1.68%. But then in July 1986 came the fall of LTV Corporation, the largest bankruptcy ever, which helped to produce a 1986 default rate of 3.394%, marginally higher than the 1982 rate and the highest ever since 1970, when Milken was a newly hired researcher and trader of arcane bonds at Drexel Firestone. While 1985 had seen a par face value of defaulting debt of $992 million, in 1986 it was $3.20 billion. LTV, whose defaulted debt had been underwritten by Lehman, not Drexel, caused some nervousness among junk bond investors. But there was no rush to sell from institutional investors, no large withdrawals from the FTY or so high-yield funds investing about $20 billion. In other words, none of the panic that leads to distress selling, that triggers further panic, that causes a market to collapse. And within about 2 weeks, the junk market rallied to its pre-LTV state. Thus LTV was perceived as, and quickly became, an isolated event. It was one that caught even Milken off guard, since he had not believed that a major steel company would go into bankruptcy. When one of Drexel's senior investment bankers told a client that Milken had taken an $11 million loss on LTV, the client, in perfect sync with the Drexel mood in summer '86, quipped, "Lunch money." It is true that by the fall of 1986 there was a growing chorus of business analysts worrying about the amount of debt in this country and the signs of strain it was causing, in the increasing numbers of loan defaults, bankruptcies, bank failures and savings and loan closings. By the end of 1986, total debt, federal plus other borrowing, would top $7 trillion, up nearly $1 trillion in 1 year. Debt would total 1.7 times gross national product, the highest such ratio since the worst years of the Depression. The market value debt to equity percentage, a key measure of the corporate debt burden, was 71.4% for 1985. That compared with 35.3% in 1961, 46.7% in 1971, 91.1% in 1974, and 70% in 1981. But the concern of these business analysts tended to be global, running the gamut from federal debt to corporate to consumer, and was not focused particularly on Milken and his enclave in Beverly Hills. It could not reasonably be, because their debt was not a problem, leverage was not a problem, the thrifts that were failing were not Milken's protégés, and the deals that were going into default in the main were not his, either. Many of the most highly leveraged acquisitions that he had backed were now refinancing their debt at lower rates. Taking advantage of the surging bull market, many were replacing straight bonds with either convertible bonds or equity. Equitize, in fact, was the new slogan at Drexel. By the end of 1987, Drexel would say that almost $22 billion in public high-yield debt had been retired in 1985 to 87, during which time about $99 billion of such debt was issued. Despite these signs of growing stability in Milken's empire, the Isaiahs of the financial world were still proclaiming that the Milken experiment had worked so far only because interest rates had gone down and the stock market had continued to soar. But when the next recession came, they declared darkly, that empire would be shown to be made of mirrors. Some of Milken's rival investment bankers too suggested that he, with the help of his and his group's capital, and Drexel's, and that of his ever-ready inner circle, had been able to create the illusion of a thriving supply and demand market, by fishing the trouble spots and providing liquidity when and where it was needed. When the recession came, they predicted, even Milken at the controls, with all his machinations and his billions of dollars of capital, would not be able to forestall a tidal wave of defaults. In the fall of 1986, however, that recession, which was indeed the necessary test for Milken's grand design, was nowhere in sight. And the critics, who in the face of Milken's success had begun to sound niggling, were all but drowned out. A spate of magazine articles about Milken appeared, rivaling each other in the lavishness of their praise. Forbes, which in 1984 had featured a cover showing Milken and his favored, Fred Carr, Tom Spiegel, Saul Steinberg and others, riding a merry-go-round, with an accompanying article by reporters Alan Sloan and Howard Rudnitsky that detailed the interlockings of his network, now published a piece, by the same reporters, laced with admiration and entitled, A One-Man Revolution. Businessweek, with Milken on its cover, quoted Harvard Business School professor Samuel Hayes comparing Milken to J.P. Morgan and ran an editorial headed, Junk Bonds Deserve a Little Respect. For institutional investor, the headline said it all, Milken the Magnificent. Even The Economist, that sober periodical, gave its imprimatur to Milken's accomplishments in November 1986. In an editorial, in defense of Raiders, its editors essentially sided with the President's Council of Economic Advisers. The editorial declared that the Raiders in their junk bond financed acquisitions were helping to make American business leaner and more competitive, instituting operating efficiencies through better management. The assumption of debt, it noted, is not necessarily Professor L-Igate but can, in fact, as Milken had been repeating in his tireless litany year after year, impose a most wondrous discipline. All these plaudits did nothing to mellow Milken or soften his iconoclastic edge. Overriding conference idents, the utter conviction of his rightness, had been his insignia even when he was a 22-year-old summer intern at Drexel Firestone in Philadelphia and wanted to bring salvation to that Phi RM's beleaguered back-off ICE. Now, after more than a decade of having preached his unorthodox gospel about low-rated bonds, after having pioneered their issuance, eliciting first the disdain and later the antipathy of the corporate establishment, Milken had the certitude of the proven prophet. That he had been so right about so much, while others were so wrong, was a point that no one who listened to the few speeches he had given in early 1986 was allowed to ignore. His recurrent theme was, perception versus reality, or, put more bluntly, how he could see what most of the world could not. Self-serving as it was, He had in fact built his legendary career and fortune upon this ability. First, in seeing the creditworthiness of companies that the rating agencies deemed junk, and later in seeing the undervalued assets of companies that were candidates for buyouts or takeovers. His was the clairvoyance of the outsider. He held himself apart from the mainstream. He had become both prophet and engineer of change. And that was why, he believed, resistance to his endeavors had lately been so violent. "We're faced with change," Milken told a group of money managers in Boston in February 1986. "And all of us have resisted this change. Our regulators have resisted change. Our politicians have resisted change. Portfolio managers have resisted change. Traders have resisted change. Salesmen have resisted change." We're not willing to recognize that James Dean, in the movie The Giant, was really the person who was financially strong, not Rock Hudson. That many of our money center banks today are financially weak, even though we might perceive them to be strong. That many of the insurance companies in the United States that are considered to be mavericks are the strong insurance companies today, not the weak. That many of the savings and loans, who have used different investment techniques, and different ways to build their capital structures, will be the survivors and the strong savings and loans of the future, not the weak. Why are they not accurately perceived? Because their customs, their methods, their personalities, their people, are not the way they were in the past, and are not immediately accepted. Often, what's old is weak and what's new is strong. The common perception is that capital is scarce, Milken declared in his time-worn message, but in fact capital is abundant, it is vision that is scarce. In a favorite exercise, Milken offered example after example of disastrous investments of excess cash made by those blue-chip companies rated AAA, the companies he had always disdained. The major international oil companies have had from $2 billion to $7 billion in excess cash for a 10 to 20-year period, he said. Exxon squandered perhaps as much as $3 billion in its foray into information systems. Standard of California made an $8 billion bid for a company named American Metal Climax which, had it been accepted, would have caused Standard to lose $12 billion. Atlantic Rich IL'd lost in excess of $2 billion in the metals business. So we see here, Milken drew the moral, excess capital is not strength. It leads to the opportunity of weakness. But if one has vision, the results are very different. While Milken had not mentioned them by name, his star protégés, Columbia Savings and First Executive, were clearly in mind when he spoke of those savings and loans and insurance companies that are today's mavericks and would be the strong institutions of the future. Now he tallied his triumphs. Even though Forbes magazine would have us believe otherwise, Mr. Perelman, who runs Pantry Pride today, seems to have had the ability of knowing what to do with his money. In the last 6 to 7 years, not only has he taken a few $1 million and purchased McAndrews and Forbes, and then bought Wilbur Chocolates, and then took the company private, and then bought Consolidated Cigar, and then bought Technicolor, but he has subsequently invested money in Pantry Pride. Pantry Pride was only selling at 3 3/4 before Mr. Perelman took it over, and is now selling somewhere between 11 and 12, in a matter of less than 1 year. Why? Because a management team has been brought to bear, which was willing to take the risk, who had the vision of value, and to find the backing of you in this room and other institutional investors around the country, willing to loan them money with the understanding that they had to commit to repay your interest and principal, and have the vision or foresight, which was the scarce resource, to identify those assets that are undervalued in the marketplace, the difference between a perception and the reality, and to use your money wisely. Forbes magazine, I don't mean to dwell on their articles, recently wrote about 2 people who run a company called Triangle, who took advantage of the poor unsuspecting public, I don't know how, and bought National Can. Anyone in this room, anyone at Drexel Burnham, anyone could have bought National Can. It required a down payment of $100 million in equity, $490 million in debt. Today the company will make in 1986 probably $140 to $105 million from operations, and the stock of the public company that bought it has increased fourfold. So, Milken summed up, the opportunities are there. The question is, who sees the value? A rhetorical question if ever there was one. Milken heralded the return of the owner-manager, back in American corporate life after an absence of 30 or 40 years. This had been Milken and Joseph's tenet, from the time they started raising debt for their junk issuers back in 1977. They had wanted those clients to have significant stakes in their companies. In 1980–81, three key Drexel clients, Meshulam Riklis, Carl Lindner and Saul Steinberg, had each taken their companies private, in the ultimate extension of the owner-manager philosophy. And then the mammoth LBOs of the mid-80s, largely financed by Drexel, had further amplified the trend. On another occasion, in 1986, Milken pointed to the Beatrice buyout as an example of the efficiencies that can be wrought by owner management. Why is this company worth $50 a share 3 months after the company decided to sell stock at 32? This company spent hundreds of millions of dollars on things an owner-manager might not spend money on. The company spent as much as $70 million a year sponsoring races. Elimination of $70 million a year in cash out FLO increases your value by $500 million a year. The company spent $30 to $50 million on corporate image advertising, so that people would know what a Beatrice was. Maybe as an owner you feel it is not important to know what a Beatrice is. You think knowing what Tropicana orange juice and Samsonite luggage, Beatrice products, is good enough. And so there you can add another $300 to $400 million a year. Corporate home off ICE overhead was $220 million plus a year to run a $12 billion business. S-Mark, purchaser of Beatrice, ran a $6 billion business on a $23 million corporate overhead level. Milken speaks extemporaneously. He usually scribbles a few notes on his way to his speeches, but he only glances at them. He never gropes for a number. The facts and figures pour forth, as effortlessly as though on a computer printout. The set of his jaw is as taut as his delivery. While he strives occasionally for some humorous one-liner, he is most himself when he is serious, hammering home one purposeful point after another. But at his February 1986 speech in Boston, to a group of high-yield fund money managers whom he had courted back in the late 70s, he did make one remark, lighter than the rest, that seemed to engage his fancy. There are at least 500 people in this country worth $1 billion, Milken said intently. Skip a beat. That gives us all something to shoot for, he added, with a smile of pleasure that told his listeners he was already over the mark. 12. Milken's Money Machine. In the fall of 1986, the street was FI-LLED with Milken imitators. They underwrote junk bonds, cutting the once secure 3 to 4% fees, and sometimes to Milken's fury they beat him out on a deal. Now they were offering bridge loans in an attempt to cut into his buyout and takeover business. But try as they might, what they could not do was be Michael Milken. They did not have the storehouse of knowledge about this market that he had built since his earliest infatuation with it in the 60s. Much of that knowledge he had fed into his computer system which, as he liked to say, shows who owns securities, when they bought them, where every security might be in the Western world. They did not have Drexel's portfolio of about $5 billion in junk, more than 10 times larger than any of theirs. And, most important, they could not sit out in Beverly Hills at Milken's NASA-like console of direct phone lines to buyers whom he had cultivated, enriched. In many instances created. Buyers whose commonality was that they owed him, and parcel out billions of dollars of bonds among them in pieces of $25 million, $50 million, $100 million, more. In that, he was inimitable. In December 1985, Drexel had backed the bid of GAF, a chemical and building materials company controlled by its chairman, Samuel Heyman, for Union Carbide, a chemical giant more than 10 times the size of GAF. Drexel had said it was highly conference ident, that it could raise $3.50 billion, the largest highly conference ident claim up to that time. Ultimately, GAF chairman Samuel Heyman decided to stop raising his bid and to sell into Union Carbide's defensive counteroffer, made to all shareholders, thereby reaping a Professor IT of $250 million for GAF. He stopped, he would later say, because he thought the price had simply gotten too high to make good business sense. Milken and Drexel had wanted him to go higher, and had assured him that the firm would raise the additional financing required to top the Union Carbide recapitalization offer. Heyman recalled going out to see Milken in early December 1985, a few days before GAF announced its offer. I wanted to look him in the eye in order to take the measure of his conference ident's level in getting the job done. He gave me his personal assurance that he would be able to raise the financing, and he reviewed with me a list of individual and institutional investors who had customarily participated in similar Drexel transactions, and indicated which ones he thought would be likely purchasers of the carbide issue. Within 3 weeks of that meeting, Mike had delivered to me on New Year's Eve signed commitments for $3.5 billion from substantially the same list of buyers he had earlier predicted would be interested in the deal. Considering the mammoth size of the financing, that it was a complicated hostile transaction, and that it was accomplished in 3 weeks over Christmas vacation, it was a Herculean effort, Heyman concluded. Capital, as Milken loved to say and to prove to the world, time and time again, is not a scarce resource, indeed. But there had never been quite so much at his fingertips as there was by the fall of '86. This was a tribute to his money machine, which had of course owed most copiously at its fount but had also spread its abundance, increasingly, through all its parts. First Executive and Columbia Savings, both of which Milken had an equity stake in, as well as pride of authorship, had flourished and continued to gorge on the junk bonds that had gird them. By the fall of 1986, Thomas Spiegel was investing at least $3 billion of Columbia's $10.20 billion in assets in junk. And that was conservative compared to Fred Carr, who was investing in junk about $7 billion, roughly 60% of First Executive's assets. In a sense, considering the enormity of their investments and their closeness to Milken, these institutions functioned as his merchant banking arms. Some who understood this relationship found it amusing that a branch off ICE of Columbia Savings should be on the second floor of Milken's building, which was locked, and could not be entered except with clearance. On a smaller scale, others in this game had also prospered. Money managers who had started in the late 70s with $50 million or $200 million to invest in Milken's junk bonds were now managing portfolios of $1–2 billion. James K. Wood, for example, who had been managing money for American General when Milken visited him in Houston in 1978, was now running his own fund, K. Wood Christian, which had about $1.50 billion of mainly S&L money. Howard Marks, who had been managing money at Citibank in New York when he came out to visit Milken in Century City and concluded that Milken's shop should be a Harvard Business School case study, was now managing about $1 billion, some of its first executives at Trust Company of the West. And David Solomon, who had started out at First Investors when it was a FL Edgling & Junk and then had become by 1978 the giant of the high-yield fund buyers, with about $500 million to invest, was, by 1986, running his own fund, Solomon Asset Management, and investing about $2 billion. Then there was the Milken Placement Service. Michael is known for placing people who lose jobs, or who want to change jobs, commented one rival. That way, he gets the reputation for loyalty, and he also has all these different pots to draw upon. It's a double whammy. Mark Schenkman, who had Phi RST met Milken in 1977 when he was an equity portfolio manager at the Fidelity Fund in Boston, became the portfolio manager at First Investors after David Solomon's abrupt departure in 1983. Schenkman left First Investors in the spring of 1985. For a brief interim period of a couple of months he advised Ronald Perelman on how to invest, mainly with Drexel, the money Drexel had raised for him in its blind pool. Then, in the early fall of 1985, he opened up Schenkman Capital Management, with Albert Fuss, of Drexel in London, as his 24% partner. By the fall of 1986, Schenkman Capital Management had about $500 million to invest. Schenkman also was now investment advisor for two Drexel offshore funds for foreign investors, Finsbury and Winchester Recovery. Finsbury was a general high-yield fund. Winchester Recovery invested only in bankrupt securities, Milken's specialty, from the early 70s. Schenkman and David Solomon each were managing 50% of Finsbury. By having ostensibly independent managers, Drexel avoided the conference LICT of interest problem it would have had if it had put its own new issues into these funds. And for Drexelites who wanted to leave the firm, and were doing so on friendly terms, Milken often found or created new situations. Thomas Siduric, whose brother, David Siduric, was one of Milken's troops in Beverly Hills, worked brief LY at Drexel in New York and then decided he wanted something different. He became the manager of a $300 million junk portfolio at Coastal, a thrift in LA. No one ever really has to leave Drexel. That's what is so great about it, Thomas Siduric declared. If you say you're tired, you want a change of pace, they say, fine, we can put you over here. Joan Conan had moved out from New York to join the Milken Group but never made the adjustment to California and wanted to return home. Milken is said to have helped her find a job at the Equitable, where she was now, in '86, running a $2 billion fund, investing mainly in buyouts. Another of the old-timers, Dort Cameron III, who had been with Milken from the Drexel Firestone days, left Drexel in 1984 to join the Base Investment Limited Partnership, subsequently renamed Investment Limited Partnership, in Greenwich, Connecticut. He did it with Milken's blessing and some of his money. Cameron's partners there were Drexel, the Base family and Richard Rainwater, who was the Base's chief dealmaker until he went independent in 1985. By 1986, Cameron had at least $2 billion to invest, mainly for LBOs. Gary Winnick, who had joined Milken's group in 1978 and had become one of his key salesmen, followed in Cameron's footsteps. In 1985, Winnick moved across the street from Milken's Beverly Hills off ICE to open Passive IC Asset Holdings. Winnick invested about $30 million, a Drexel Burnham Group put in $40 million, and the Base family and related entities put in $45 million. With that equity base, slightly less than $500 million of junk debt raised by Drexel, and bank borrowings, Passive IC Asset had over $1 billion. Both Passive IC Asset and ILP are structured in ways that ostensibly limit Milken's and Drexel's role in decision-making. At Passive IC Asset, for example, the two general partners are Winnick and Richard Sandler, Milken's ubiquitous lawyer and his brother's boyhood friend, who appears in so many Milken partnerships. Winnick needs the approval of Sandler, his general partner, for certain transactions. The strived-for illusion here, of course, is that Sandler is something other than Milken's proxy. It is no different from Belvedere, the firm in which Milken owned the majority interest but was only a limited partner, and thus when asked about it in an SEC deposition could profess general ignorance about its operations, pointing to his limited partner status. This was, in fact, the position he took in a 1985 SEC deposition with regard to all the limited partnerships in which he was an investor. "I don't have, investment authority for any of these accounts," Milken testified. Questioned again on this point, Milken testified, "I would not make the investment decisions, correct?" The idea of Milken allowing his control over his investments to be so usurped, however, is simply not believable. Indeed, Otter Creek, that early investment partnership for his group, had a revolving investment committee of 3 Milken Group members who theoretically made all investment decisions. Said one former member of Milken's group who served on that investment committee, "I never made one decision. It was all Mike. Cameron and Winnick had done their hard time with Milken, accumulated many millions, and then moved out to augment their fortunes as Drexel adjuncts. But probably no one else joined Drexel, was relocated in a satellite group, and made his fortune, in as short order as did Guy Dove III. Dove had worked at Drexel Firestone in the early 70s. He had left Drexel and bounced through 4 other firms. When, in 1982, he was rehired at Drexel in Washington, D.C., where he did some selling for Milken, Dove had just signed a consent agreement with the SEC. The SEC alleged that he had sold stock short on inside information for a Professor IT of $22,906.25, which he was made to disgorge. Dove had been an institutional salesman at Schroeder Capital Management when he did the trades that were the subject of the consent decree. After signing it, he realized, according to Schroeder's then senior vice president Howard Quosie, that he would neither move ahead nor make more money at Schroeder. So he went to Drexel. Quosie recalled, "Guy was always really aggressive in his own account, not like the rest of us money managers. We might have tried to enhance our personal wealth now and then, but he was really aggressive." In 1984, Dove moved to California and went across the street from Drexel to be chief investment officer at Atlantic Capital. This was the Atlantic Capital that committed to buy bonds in Icon's bid for Philips, in Peltz's and May's for National Can, in Perelman's for Revlon. In the $725 million that Milken raised for Revlon, Atlantic Capital, through its various subsidiaries, committed to buy $130 million of the bonds. In the $3.50 billion of commitments that Milken had collected for Heyman in his Union Carbide bid, Atlantic Capital had come in for $155 million. This was the ubiquitous Atlantic Capital. In the Drexel megadeals of 1985, it was among the biggest buyers, if not the biggest. Of all Milken's ready pools, Atlantic Capital was the one about which other investors, even those close to Drexel, knew the least. While other buyers sometimes used street names, probably no other buyer went by as many names or used as many subsidiaries in these deals as Atlantic Capital. In Revlon, there were commitments to buy bonds not only from Atlantic Capital Corporation, but also from these related entities: Worldwide Trading, SSC3 Corporation, Garrison Capital Corporation and First Oak Financial Corporation. In its 1984–85 heyday, Atlantic Capital had at least $3–4 billion to invest. While First Executive's investment pool was somewhat larger, First Executive, like all Insurance companies had to submit a list of all securities in its investment portfolio to the state insurance commissioner at the end of each year. By the fall of '86, in fact, the New York State Insurance Commissioner, who had jurisdiction over Carr's Executive Life in New York, a smaller subsidiary of the California company, had indicated that he was considering imposing a limit on the amount of junk bonds an insurer could buy. Similarly, Tom Spiegel's $3 billion pool at Columbia Savings was overseen by increasingly critical regulators at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. And by the fall of '86, those regulators indicated that they expected to propose regulations that would limit Thrift's junk bond investments in some way, perhaps by limiting the amount that could be invested in a single company, or by requiring that investments be spread among various companies and industries. Tom Spiegel and Fred Carr had enjoyed great license for years, but theirs were not wholly unmonitored investments. Atlantic Capital's were. Atlantic Capital's game was the brainchild of a former investment banker in municipal finance at Shearson named Pierre Wedvik. In the early '80s, when interest rates went sky high, single-family mortgage revenue bond issues began to proliferate, since financing a home in the private sector had become extremely expensive. Typically, in these housing deals, a municipality would sell its bond issue and invest in an investment contract with the proceeds, which would remain in that investment contract until they were needed to purchase mortgages. That contract, which had to be provided by an institution with a high investment grade rating, promised to pay a certain rate of interest on the funds, and to repay the principal in an allotted period of time. In most of these housing deals, the bulk of the funds were moved out of the investment contracts and used either to purchase mortgages or to repay the bonds, generally within 3 years. However, some of the funds, approximately 10%, were invested in a debt service reserve fund for the full term of the bond issues, usually 30+ years. Wedvik's idea was to sell these investment contracts to the municipalities and, somehow, make a big spread between the rate he had to pay and what he made on his investments. An arbitrage. All he needed was an institution with a high investment grade rating, and a crackerjack investment strategy. An AA rating was provided through a Mexican named Rodrigo Rocha, who in 1981 had taken over a Bermuda-based reinsurance company. Clarendon. Rocha's cohort at Clarendon was Erkki Pesonen, then chairman of Kansa General Insurance Company in Helsinki, Finland. Kansa owned about 35% of Clarendon. Kansa was also a member of a pool of reinsurers for First Stratford, the reinsurance company formed in 1982 and owned primarily by a Milken Group and First Executive. Most important, Kansa had an AA rating from Standard & Poor's. So Atlantic Capital was created, as a subsidiary of Clarendon. Atlantic Capital issued the investment contract, which was backed by Clarendon, which was covered by a cut-through agreement, assuming liability from Kansa. That, however, was only half the farrago. The other was an investment strategy. And that, as Wedvik and Rocha soon discovered, they did not have. When they started selling these investment contracts in 1982, they invested the money in treasuries, which they attempted to hedge. They lost their asses on that, recalled one former Drexel executive. I remember going to a cocktail party in '84, and Rodrigo was introducing his hedge guy from Stanford, who had all these computer models. About 4 or 5 months later, I heard they took a really big hit. By mid-'84, they had moved to Milken's junk, bonds and preferred stock. Now they were making a spread of at least 400 to 500 basis points. There are 100 basis points in 1 percentage point, sometimes as much as 1,000. They would promise a return of 8% or so and then invest the money in junk that was paying 13 to 18%. Guy Dove came to be their trader, and Milken's man in the shop. It was rumored at Drexel that Milken had an equity stake in Clarendon through his investment partnerships. But those partnerships were essentially run as blind pools, so even those at Drexel who had money in them generally did not know what their investments were. It was great while it lasted. Wedvik, who had reportedly been making no more than $70,000 a year at Shearson in his pre-Atlantic Capital days, now was said to be making about $10 million a month. His lifestyle lent credence to the talk. "I saw Pierre not long ago," one friend remarked, "and he was driving a Rolls-Royce. But it was only one of them that he owns." When Wedvik married in early 1985, Drexel threw a bachelor party for him in Las Vegas and FLEU in friends and key clients. It was an extravaganza worthy of someone who was said at the time to be Milken's biggest client. In these bond deals, it was typically the underwriter who decided which bidder would be awarded the investment contract. Major commercial banks and insurance companies FLU'd this market in the early 80s. But in California, where Atlantic Capital was most active, no institution could compete with it. There was no disclosure required as to how the funds would be invested, and most underwriters who accepted Atlantic Capital bids apparently looked to the A rating and not beyond. Of a half-dozen interviewed by this reporter, all said they did not know the money was being invested in junk bonds. One asserted, for about 2 years, they, Atlantic Capital, were tearing up and down the state, getting any deal they wanted. It was almost impossible not to do business with them. And for a long time they managed to keep it very quiet, the rates they were getting. I remember I was with Pierre in a restaurant in early 1985, and I said, "Pierre, how are you doing this?" And he said, "We've got the best options guy in the country." I can't say what they were doing was illegal, this underwriter concluded. But it certainly failed the good faith test. If the underwriters were ignorant of how the money was being invested, FGIC, Financial Guarantee Insurance Company, the bond insurer which insured some of Atlantic's investment contracts, was not. One analyst at FGIC says, however, that it was their knowledge of Atlantic's investment strategy that caused them to limit the coverage to $300 million. What was worrying, this analyst adds, was not only that Atlantic was putting the money into junk, but that it was also committing a cardinal investment sin. Like the S&Ls which had borrowed short-term money and lent long, and so got caught when interest rates skyrocketed and had to pay more for their money than they were receiving on their long-term loans, Atlantic Capital had borrowed short. Most of these funds had to be repaid in 3 years, and lent long. The securities they bought typically had maturities of 10 years or more. It was a game of musical chairs, this analyst said. They were using the new money that came in to make payouts on the old contracts. They weren't liquidating the securities. So there was certainly the risk that if interest rates had risen, in the end there would not have been enough money in the securities, whose price would have fallen, to make the payouts. Or if there had been any big defaults, in the junk issues. But there weren't. By the fall of 1985, it was essentially over. Standard & Poor's finally exerted sufficient pressure on Kansa that company refused to extend its cut-through agreements to any new investment contracts. Atlantic Capital stopped selling these contracts. It had sold about 100 by the late fall of '85. Within the next year, Pesonen, who had led Kansa into the foray with Rocha and Clarendon, left Kansa to join Clarendon full-time in its London ICE. He was replaced by a new chairman and management from outside the company who vowed to refocus Kansa on its domestic, rather than international, activities. And in December 1986 Standard & Poor's downgraded Kansa from A to A substantial downgrade, in large part because of its relationship with Atlantic Capital and its concern about Atlantic Capital's investment portfolio. Standard & Poor's noted, however, that Kansa had already taken steps to allay its concerns. In particular, Kansa General's intention to no longer reinsure new exposures of its one-third owned Clarendon Group will reduce over time the overall role in the company's portfolio as those exposures run off. Many of the bonds which had been backed by these contracts would also be downgraded by early 1987, so the bondholders were left with devalued bonds. Dove too by 1986 had shifted his base of operations to Clarendon's London off ICE. In December 1986, U.S. District Judge Owen Panner granted a preliminary injunction to the Princeville Development Corporation, allowing it to block the attempts to acquire control of it by Dove, through Garrison Capital Corporation, AFFI liated with Clarendon, Charles Knapp, through Trafalgar Holdings, and others. Among his other findings, Panner cited numerous disclosure violations by Garrison, including its having failed to disclose that it was acting as part of a group, in an attempt to seize control of Princeville. Panner also found that, while Dove and Knapp were posing as only sources of financing for the tender offer for Princeville, in fact that financing, through the issuing of warrants, would place between 40% and 90% of the equity in Dove's and Knapp's hands. The offer to purchase was fraudulent. Panner found, inasmuch as Princeville shareholders were prevented from discovering that managerial control of Princeville could pass to persons with, at best, dubious pasts, Dove and Knapp. For Dove, Atlantic Capital was surely a once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity. Like other members of the Milken network, Atlantic Capital benefited enormously